Good morning, everyone. It's Rabbi Akiva Males, and I hope you're well. Today is Friday. It's December 4th. We're getting ready for Parshas Vayishlach. In the Parsha this week, we're going to be reading about Yaakov Avinu. After having spent 22 years outside the land of Israel, he is now going to return. Remember, he left Eretz Yisrael after his parents, Yitzchak and Rivka, had told him to leave. It wasn't safe for him to stay in Israel. Esav wanted to kill him, and also his mother and father felt that he needed to get married, and they were not satisfied with any of the local girls that were available from the Canaanim. They wanted him to return to the family's homeland in Padan Aram, and that's where he would find a wife for himself. After 22 years, he's now returning with not one but 4 wives and 12 children. Not the 12 Shvatim. Binyamin hasn't been born yet, but 12 children if you're including Dinah, and an incredible number of flock, maidservants, servants. He's got an incredible entourage he's returning to Eretz Yisrael with. But there's one problem. He's very nervous about his reunion, this encounter he's going to have with his brother, Esav. Last he saw Esav hated him and wanted to kill him. So Yaakov is very, very nervous. And the Parsha begins with him employing all sorts of strategies. What can he do to get on Esav's good side so when this encounter, this reunion finally occurs, Esav won't lash out at him? And it seems from everything that we read in the Psukim, all of the efforts that Yaakov made were successful. And Baruch Hashem, that reunion, when it finally does occur, is not a violent one. Now, when Yaakov is preparing his messengers to send these gifts to Esav, so there's a pasuk here that Rashi jumps on, and we're probably all familiar with this. The pasuk says, "Vayitzavo sam lemor." He commands these messengers that when they're bringing the gifts to Esav, this is what they need to say. This is what you need to say to my master Esav. Ko amar avdecha Yaakov, so says your servant Yaakov. Im lavan garti, I have sojourned, I have lived for a temporary amount of times. 22 years was a long time, but it's still in the big picture of things was temporary. Im lavan garti, I have lived with Lavan, va'echar ad ata, and I've delayed returning to Israel until now. Rashi quotes here a very famous teaching of Chazal. Rashi says, what is garti? So you've got to rearrange the letters a little bit. Davar acher garti begematria taryag. Garti, gimel, reish, taf, yud. If you rearrange those letters, they could also spell the word taryag, and it has the same numerical value, which is 613. Klomar in Lavan Arasha garti. Yaakov was sending this message to Esav, saying, I've lived with Lavan, who was a very wicked man. The taryag mitzvah shamarti. Despite the fact I was living in this hostile environment that was totally against my value system, nonetheless, I did my best to observe all of the 613 mitzvahs. Again, even though Har Sinai has not occurred yet, it won't occur for hundreds of years, nonetheless, we have this Masorah that the Avos, through Ruach HaKodesh, through divine inspiration, through intuition, what have you, they did their best. They were aware of what the mitzvahs would be, and they did their best to observe them. So Yaakov Avinu is sending this message to Esav, that don't think just because I was out of Eretz Yisrael, my spiritual caliber has lessened in any degree. To the contrast, even though I was living in Lavan Harasha in such a wicked person's house, I strengthened myself, I kept strong, I held strong, and I did everything I could to observe all 613 mitzvahs. So therefore, I have a lot of zechuyos working in my favor. So you might want to really think twice before messing with me, because I've got a lot of zechuyos, I've got a lot of merits, and Hashem is with me. That's the message he's sending to Esav. Not only did I observe all the mitzvahs, but I didn't learn from Esav. I was not affected, I wasn't negatively impacted by being in his close presence. It's a very famous Rashi. And of course, whenever we learn this with our students, we make the point of saying, look at Yaakov, even when he was away from a Torah environment, that didn't change who he was. And that's a lesson for ourselves. Even if we leave our school, we leave our community, we go on vacation, whatever it may be, we're away from shul, we're away from a Jewish community, that doesn't change our responsibility to Torah and mitzvahs, and we still have to live a life of Torah and mitzvahs regardless of the environment we find ourselves in. That's what we always do with this Rashi when we teach it. However, I saw a beautiful question and answer on this Rashi. And let me read it to you. It's from Rav Moshe Sternbach in Yerushalayim. Rav Moshe Sternbach in his Sefer on Chumash Tam V'das, he asks the following excellent question. Let me read this to you. He says, V'tamua, Rashi says, Im lavan garti v'taryag mitzvah shamarti. I observed all of the 613 mitzvahs. Tamua, sharayesh mitzvah shetluyos beretz Yisrael. There are many of the 613 mitzvahs which cannot be observed outside of Israel, can only be observed in Eretz Yisrael. Uve mikdash, and many of the mitzvahs only can be observed in the Beis HaMikdash. So v'yeshav shir l'kaiman rak b'matzavim meyuchadim, and there's other mitzvahs that can only be observed in very unique sets of circumstances. How did Yaakov say, I observed all 613 mitzvahs? Impossible. So listen to what Rosh Sternbach answers. So we can explain as follows. Look closely at what Rashi said. Yaakov never said shekiyam, that he actually observed all of the mitzvahs. Elarak shamran. He says, I guarded them. I was shomer the mitzvahs. What does that mean? That is an expression of waiting and looking forward. Where do we get this idea from? We're going to read next week in Parshas Vayishlach. The pasuk tells us that Yosef starts telling these dreams that he's having to his family members, to his brothers. They're very upset at him. And he tells them to his father about how these dreams of the authority he's going to have. And the pasuk says, Va'aviv shamaris hadavar. His father literally would mean he guarded the matter. But Rashi tells us, what does it mean, Vaviv Shamaris Hadavar? He says in the words of Chazal, Hayamamtinu mitzape masayavo, that Yaakov was waiting and he was he was anxious, he was look forward with expectation. When would these dreams be fulfilled? So Rashi's telling us there's another way to understand Shamar. Shamar doesn't mean observed. Shamar could always mean someone was anxious, someone was waiting, he was looking for an opportunity for these. So Rav Sternbach wants to say that's what Rashi means here. When he says, Im lavan garti v'taryag mitzvah shamarti, of course Yaakov couldn't have observed all 613 mitzvahs. He was outside of Israel. There was no Beis HaMikdash and so many other circumstances. But nonetheless, he was anxious and he knew what the mitzvahs were, and he wished he could be observing them. As long as he was living in the house of Lavan, he couldn't wait. He was anxious. He was anticipating, when will I have the opportunity to fulfill all the mitzvahs of Hashem? And if we ever find ourselves in that circumstance where we are anxiously awaiting and we say, I cannot wait, I'm anxious, when will I be able to observe the mitzvahs? But I'm unable to do so because of some compelling reason that's holding me back. In the eyes of Hashem, it's as if the person did observe the mitzvahs. So Yaakov could say the Taryag mitzvah shamarti. What do you mean? He was outside of Israel. He was outside. There was no Beis HaMikdash. Nonetheless, since he was anxious, he wished he could have observed those. And if all things being equal, if there was nothing impeding him, there was nothing holding him back, he would have observed those. So in Hashem's eyes, he did observe them because that's what he would have done if there wasn't for those compelling factors that were holding him back. It's such a beautiful idea because we oftentimes find ourselves in situations where for one reason or another, we're just not able to perform the mitzvah that we want to do. What is our attitude going to be? If our attitude is, oh, hey, look at that, Onis Rachman Apatre, the Torah can't hold me accountable, God can't hold me accountable because I didn't have the opportunity to do the mitzvah. Okay, we got off scot-free and we won't be held accountable. But there's nothing positive as if we actually did the mitzvah. But if my attitude is, I wish I could have done that mitzvah, and I would have done that mitzvah. I'm anxious. I wish I await the opportunity to do that mitzvah, but I can't do it now. I'm being held back for some kind of external factor. That's a whole different attitude. And if I have that attitude, then Hashem could consider it as if I did it, because I would have done it if I had the opportunity. That's Taryag mitzvah shamarti. Even though he didn't actually have the ability to do so, he gets the credit as if he did so because he wanted to, and he would have done it. So it's all about our attitude. When I hit a roadblock, when I'm unable to go through with performing a mitzvah, observing a mitzvah, whether or not Hashem sees it as if I actually did observe that mitzvah, it's going to all be talui. It's going to all depend on what my attitude was. If I'm just happy, okay, I'm excused. Okay, no negatives here, but no positives either. But if my attitude is that, oh yeah, I wish I could have done that mitzvah. I'm anxious, and I await the opportunity to do that mitzvah. Hashem will give me credit as if I observed that mitzvah now, even though I never actually did it. This is such an important lesson, and I'm thinking about this so much during the pandemic, because there were several months where all of us were unable to go to shul, go to minyan, daven with a minyan. People who needed to say kaddish couldn't say kaddish. Nobody had that opportunity. But what was our attitude during that time? Our attitude was at time was like, look at that, I got a hall pass. Now I'm home free. So then, okay, nothing held against us, but we didn't accrue, we didn't gain anything positive. But if our attitude was, I wish I could have been with a minyan. I wish I could have been saying Kaddish. I wish I could have been doing something more, hearing, laning, all that. Then Hashem, even though we physically weren't there, Hashem will give us credit for that. Shamarti. It's like we still did observe that. And let's not kid ourselves. Even with our shuls and schools open in very, very limited sense right now, with social distancing and masking and limited numbers, all that, there are still significant numbers in our community that for one reason or another are still not able to make use of that. They still can't come to shul based on what their doctor's orders are, their own concerns, whatever the case may be. There are still members of our community around the world who are still unable to participate fully in Jewish communal life at shul, at schools and whatnot. And the question is, what's their attitude going to be? If the attitude is, this has been a really long exemption, again, nothing will be held against them. But if the attitude is, I wish I could be there, and I know that's their attitude because I speak to people every single day, and they tell me how much they wish they could be at shul, how much they wish they could be davening with a minyan, hearing, laning, saying Kaddish. But because they have that attitude, hold strong. Hashem understands. Hashem knows that you want to be there. Hashem knows that you wish you could be there. And if there were no impediments holding you back, you would be there. And therefore, you could still say Shamarti. Even though you may not have physically been with us in shul, you were there. And Hashem will give you credit for it. So it's all about our attitude. And this is such an important idea. And let's think about that this year. When we hear the laning, those of us in shul and those of us who are at home and we're reading the laning, when we get to that pasuk, that this is what you should say to Lavan. You should say to Esav, rather, that this is what Yaakov said, Im Lavan Garti, that I lived with Lavan. And we know that Rashi says, Im Lavan Garti v'taryag mitzvah shamarti. I observed those mitzvahs. Let's remember that. Yaakov got credit for observing those mitzvahs, even though he couldn't do it physically. He couldn't actually perform those mitzvahs, but he was credited for them because he anticipated the opportunity and he anxiously awaited the chance that he would have to fulfill those mitzvahs. And since that was his attitude, Hashem credited him as if he had actually observed those mitzvahs. What a beautiful idea. And this could be a great source of chizuk, a great source of strength for all of us, for the difficult months we went through, and for many of us who are still experiencing some of those same forces holding them back at this time. I want to wish each and every one a good Shabbos.